So we're going to go on to chapter 6, and we're going to spend a couple of sessions this week on budgeting. We're going to start out with just sort of looking at what budgets are, and then we're going to look at some specific kinds of budgets, and then we're going to look at how to analyze budgets a little bit. We also have an assignment this week to do some budgeting using Excel, and I'm going to ask you to do an operating budget and a cash budget for a company, and that assignment is posted and is due at the end of the week. So, um, what's a budget? We all have budgets either in our heads or actual budgets that we use personally. You may well, some of you may have to manage budgets in your businesses or in your careers. So what is a budget? What are they for and why do we have them? And how do we use them? And maybe how do we make them more useful? So first of all, budgets are just plans. So we make a budget. This is what we hope to happen in the future. Um, it's a plan, and they're based off of where we want to go and how we intend to get there. So that's kind of what budgets are. They're quantifiable. They're dollar-based in terms of business budgeting. They can be set up in other ways as well, but generally they're most of the budgets we're going to talk about here anyway in this class are going to be dollar-based budgets. So where do I want to go? What are we trying to achieve? What's the purpose of our effort? And then how do we translate that goal into results? How do we get there? That's kind of the purpose of budgeting, is to take these somewhat intangible goals and say, how do I do things to get me to where I want to go? If you think about this as an individual, we might be budgeting for living expenses if we're students, or we might be budgeting for college expenses for our children, or we might be budgeting for um, a retirement that is going to be a comfortable retirement. Lots of different things we might budget for, and those things I just mentioned um, might be short term or might be long term. So they can be different time spans, different needs, but most budgets are relatively short term, but they may be addressed to long term goals. So we're trying to achieve our short and long range goals. Um, we need to be able to evaluate whether we're getting there, and we need to evaluate individuals who are doing things. So we need to be able to evaluate employees using budgets. Budgets are a good way to make people think ahead. Managers tend to be stuck in the weeds. Most operational managers get stuck in the weeds. They're dealing with this week's problems, this week's efforts, this week's um, um, crises, and they tend not to think ahead as well as they should. And budgets often force managers to think ahead because you've got to create a budget that requires thinking ahead, and that's a good thing. And a well-designed budget can also be a terrific communications tool and allow for coordination between various parts of an organization. I happen personally to be a big believer in budgets, well-designed budgets. I actually do some consulting on budgets and some lecturing on budgets to other groups, to corporate groups, and I think budgets can be an incredibly powerful and incredibly useful tool. Generally, what I see and what I've experienced myself and what I see when I go outside and work with people is that most budgets are not well designed. Most budgets don't do what we want them to do. In fact, in many cases, and I bet some of you have had this experience, people think of budgets as about like going to the dentist. really difficult to create, kind of a waste of time. Got to do it, but God, please don't make me do it again. Oh no, it's budget time again. I got to do this. So lots of negative feelings about budgets. So let's talk about different kinds of budgets. Operating budgets. We always start out any budget, operating or cash budget, with a revenue projection. So what do I expect to produce for revenue? Once I have a revenue projection that I'm comfortable with, a lot of the other projections become somewhat easier to make. So if I know what my revenue is planned to be, then I know how many products I have to produce. So I can figure out what my material costs, labor, and overhead are going to be, or my purchasing costs if I'm a merchandising firm, or my personnel costs if I'm a service provider. I can probably also figure out some of my selling expenses based on revenue, some of my administrative expenses, and my financing expenses. So that operating budget starts out with revenue, and then we can extrapolate everything else. So revenue is the hardest thing to predict or project. So that's where we usually have to start. Cash budgets, you're going to have an assignment to create both an operating budget and a cash budget. Cash budgets basically project cash in and cash out. That's not the same as income in and income out. And we use cash budgets to determine how much cash we're going to need and whether we need short-term financing to deal with pluses and minuses in seasonal cash flows. Almost all businesses have some kind of a business cycle. So they have times of the year when they generate more cash and times of the year when they use a lot of cash. So cash inflows and outflows are very important to project where you're going, when and where you're going to need money, and where you're going to have surplus money. So those two budgets are extremely important, and you're going to have to learn how to do those. Hello. Oops. The third budget, which we'll get to a little later in the course, next week or the week after, I guess, is capital budgets. And capital budgets are what we do when we're trying to decide about long-term acquisitions. So if we're going to buy a piece of machinery that has a 10-year life, or if we're going to buy a building that has a 30-year life, or we're going to add a new store, we're going to add something that has long-term value and usually is relatively large purchase cost. That's what the capital budget is about. And there we're looking at how much capital we may need to do that, then what the cost of that capital is and what the projected return is, and that's a time-weighted projected return. So money has a time value, so I'm going to get some return this year, that's fairly soon, but some of the return may not come for 5 or 10 years. That money that I get 5 or 10 years down the road isn't worth as much as money that I get today. So we're going to have to discount the cash flow from the future. We'll get to that a little later, but that's also an important part of the budgeting process. So when we're creating budgets, we can create static budgets, and in my experience, many companies just use static budgets. So we come up with our projected sales, and then we use those projected sales to come up with our other budgeted amounts. And we don't account for changes that might take place. So sales are higher than we expected. Oh, sales are lower than we expected. Oh, what does that do to all my other costs and all of my other budgeted items? If I have a flexible budget, I have formulas built in that take into account all of the effects of changing revenue or changing margins or changing any number of things. And I can change one thing, and if I've built the budget properly, everything else will change. So flexible budgets are much more useful because they tell me how I'm doing in reality, whereas a static budget is comparing everything to some standardized expectation. So think about, I don't know, we just take a fictitious company and we expect it to do $100,000 in sales, and we expected our cost of sales to be $50,000 and our administrative expense to be $30,000, and we would have a $20,000 profit. Well, let's say you're in charge of purchasing and you're evaluated on your purchasing, and we've got cost of sales at $50,000. Well, what happens if sales go to $120,000? Do you think I can keep my purchasing budget at 50 if my sales have increased 20%? Probably not. I'm probably going to have more products to feed into that sales, um, to feed the sales. And if I'm being evaluated on my budget, I'm supposed to spend $50,000. Well, now I'm going to spend $60,000. That's an unfavorable variance, but there's a reason for it. I'm feeding into a higher sales. That's a really simple example. But a static budget would show an unfavorable variance in purchasing and a favorable variance in sales. A flexible budget would adjust the sales number to the new number, and the projected uh, purchases would also be adjusted based on a standardized percentage. So flexible budgets are much better. They're a little harder to design and create, but they're far better in terms of how they help us, guide us to where we want to go and evaluate how we're doing. So where do we start? We start by creating revenue or output forecasts. Not an easy thing to do, and remember, forecasts are just that. They're forecasts, and we know that sometimes they're not going to be correct. So we do the best we can with the information that we have. And there's lots of potential variables. Well, what happens to our forecast? What if we raise our price? Is that going to affect our forecast? What if we lower our costs and import partially assembled parts or automate? How much will we sell, at what price, and what cost? Lots of different variables. How do I account for all those variables? Well, it's not easy. And we want it to be as accurate as possible, but it's definitely not easy. So we have to make some assumptions. We have to decide what we're going to be dealing with in inflation for this year. What kind of increase we're going to give our employees in terms of payroll increase. How much are we going to raise our prices? What kind of goals do we have? We have goals for sales. Do we have goals for profits? All of those things have to be plugged into our forecasting variables. So lots of variables, not easy. Here's a kind of a graphic that shows all the things that might affect my sales. So if you go around the edge there, starting up with the, and here in the top right, you've got economic conditions. Is the economy growing or is the economy shrinking? What's happening to the economic conditions, and specifically for my category? So the economy might be growing, but maybe I'm in the oil business, the oil service business, trying to service oil wells, and that particular part of the economy is not growing. So what's the economic conditions? What are my competitors doing? Are they bringing out new products? Are they raising price, lowering price, all of those things? What about my own prices? Am I going to change my own prices? Have I got changes in my product mix? Am I adding new products or changing products or whatever? What am I doing? What's my marketing plans? Am I going to increase my marketing budget or decrease my marketing budget? Am I planning some big promotions? I may go outside and get some research studies, definitely look at past patterns of sales, and probably the most effective method is, once again, getting down closer to the ground, if you will, to the where the rubber meets the road, and get my sales force to help me make those estimates. So I can give you an example from my past. I was importing goods from Europe into the US, and the company I was working with in Europe had sales operations in something like 50 countries. Um, and they had to estimate sales about a year ahead of delivering product because they were a manufacturer. They had to design new product. They had to then decide how many of this product was going to sell or how many they were planning on making. Then they had to source the materials. Then they had to source the manufacturer. And then they had to get it to their retailers by a certain point in time. And then the retailers would get it to the consumer. And it was about a 1 year cycle, maybe actually closer to 9 months from the time they actually went into production to the time that the consumer could actually buy the product. And the example I use, they made lots of different things, but they made clothing, and clothing required designs down to color and size, um, and the process required the purchase of materials in colorations already decided, and then the manufacture of the goods. So they would start planning for fall of, let's say, fall of 18 in the fall of 17, and somewhere around September of 17. And they would call their entire international sales force to their headquarters. They would show them their planned designs, which had been designed already, and they would have their sales force for each country write orders at that point in time down to the model number, color, size, and so forth. And these orders were not binding orders, but they wanted to know what we thought, the salespeople in each country thought they could sell. And they would then take that, use some of their own expertise, having done this for a number of years, adjust that, cut out some new production models, add colors to other models, take feedback, and then in November they would bring their biggest customers. So not Salesforce might come back, but also their largest individual retailers, distributors, and bring them in and show them the new, now adjusted line and say, okay, what do you think you'd buy? And they would get um, estimates of purchases from those. So that's November. Then they'd go back to the drawing boards again, and then they'd actually bring in and ask for actual orders from their sales force in December. So as a distributor for US and Canada, I had to write a tentative order in September, and then I had to write a real order in December. And in that period of time, I'm also consulting with my biggest customers and my sales force and going out there. And then in um, end of December, they would actually order about 50% of their yard goods of the fabrics that they were going to make these things out of. So they already had booked 50%, and they started production in January on some of the materials, and then more sales were made to smaller vendors in January and February, and then they might adjust the production goals from there. So pretty complicated. And the cost of mistakes is very high. What do you do if you build a red jacket and everybody wants to buy blue jackets? Well, you end up having to discount the red jacket to sell it one way or the other. Probably find it in TJ Maxx or Martin's or something if the color is really wrong. So that's the problem with making mistakes. Obviously, if you hit it just right, that's great. So the closer you can be to accurate is really good from that standpoint. And it's hard. And they use that ground level information as the number one thing, but all these other things have to do with that process. So flexible budgets, we've already talked a little bit about. They use cost drivers to allow the budget to change as one item changes, other items change. And cost drivers are items that drive other costs. Pretty simple concept. If my units go up, then my production costs are going to go up, and raw material requirements are going to go up. If I if I increase my sales costs are probably going to go up, but my shipping costs are going to go up. So what's driving these costs, and then how much will each cost change with extra units of sales? Cash budgets, which I'm going to ask you to do as well as part of your assignment, we want to plan for expected cash receipts and payments. And cash budgets are very important. I know when I was running my own businesses, cash budgets were perhaps more important for me than operating budgets because they enabled me to go to my financial um, people that provided my financing, banks primarily, and tell the banks when I was going to need money and how much money I would need, and also tell them when I would have free cash and be able to pay the money back. And I was in a pretty seasonal or seasonal business, cyclical seasonal business. So a lot of my revenue came in the winter. So in the summer I was cash short, and in the winter I was cash rich. So I could plan my cash needs around a cash budget. Really, really important to know if you're trying to run a finance department and keep your suppliers and your employees paid in a timely manner. So cash budgets start out with, each month starts out with the beginning cash. You add in cash receipts, subtract cash payments, get to a cash balance, and then you can either add borrowing and or invest the free cash to end up with an ending cash balance. So you're cycling through each month saying, how much surplus cash do I have each month, and or how much cash do I need? Um, Going back here for just 1 second, when you're creating a cash budget, you generally create it monthly, and you're creating it so that you know how much money you need each month. Um, this is an example of a cash budget here, and this is actually, you have an assignment this week, and your cash budget and your operating budget should look very much like these two, and these are actually numbers taken from a problem similar to what you're asking you to do. So if you look at these numbers here, you've got January's room rate, number of rooms, occupancy rate, number of days per month, and that's wrong. It should be 31, I guess. This should be 28. And this should be 31. And if this was a flexible budget, and it is in reality, but it's not when it's sitting here on my screen. I don't know why I did that. There we go. By changing those days, my revenue would change. So if this was an Excel sheet with the proper stuff in it. So when revenue changes, then all these other things would change. So over here we have an operating budget, same information, also incorrect there. So you have your total revenue, and then you have expenses, variable expenses, salaries, fixed expenses, interest expense, depreciation expense, bad debt expense, and net income. Over here, we've got money coming from next month, money coming from the current month, and money coming from the prior month, because some people don't pay on time, they get some time to pay, and some people pay early, they leave a deposit. So we've got money deposits, we've got current revenue, and we've got money that we're waiting for. And then we've got disbursements, these three things. Depreciation is a non-cash expense, so it gets completely eliminated. Interest in this particular problem is only paid twice a year, so we don't pay it every month, so we're not going to record it every month like we do in an operating budget. And bad debts aren't a cash expense either. If you notice, these three things add up to 98%, so we're only collecting 98% of our cash, so bad debts are actually 2%, but we don't have to record that because we're just going to record the cash here at 98%. So you've got a difference here. We've got cash in, this is income, this is cash in, two very different concepts. Both of them are important. This is important for financing, this is important for operations, and they're really running off the same set of data. Here we just have some differences in cash relative to what's going on for operations. This is accrual basis, this is cash basis. Zero-based budgeting. Oh, by the way, as we go back here, your assignment should look like this. I expect to see a very clean, clear assignment. It'll take you a little bit of time, but if you're good with Excel, you should be able to do this in a relatively short period of time. And it is worth about 100 points to your grade, so 10% of your grade. So important piece of information and an important assignment. Different kinds of budgets, incremental and zero-based. Incremental, we look at historical information, and we start there, we adjust up or down. So last year we spent $10,000 on maintenance. This year we're going to spend 3% more, so we'll spend $10,300. Yeah, that's right. Zero-based budgeting always starts at zero. Zero-based budgeting has gone through some interesting changes. It was a very popular thing back in the 70s and 80s. Then companies kind of got away from it. They found it too difficult to do, and at this point it's coming back. I have attached an article from McKinsey about why zero-based budgeting should be coming back and what its benefits are. So you might want to take a peek at that article. It's just a link, and it's posted to this week's information. So take a look at that zero-based budgeting article. You might see some kind of a question about that on your second quest. Zero-based budgeting is definitely better at allocating an organization's resources. It can be very time consuming, and the article that I've asked you to read can address that. But essentially with zero-based budgeting, we start with zero. We don't start with maintenance at $10,000 last year and add 3% to it. We say, what should we be spending on maintenance? Is $10,000 a reasonable amount to spend on maintenance? Should we be spending more or less? Doesn't really matter what we spent last year. What should we be spending now? So the concept of zero-based budgeting is that we don't just continue to do what we did before because we did it. We look at the reasons for doing things and examine those reasons and come up with plans for next year based on what we know now, as opposed to just copying last year's numbers and plussing them or minusing. So incremental budgeting is different, and most companies use incremental because it's easier. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do it, but lots of companies do use incremental budgeting. I was always, in my own businesses, I actually used both, and you'll see something about that in the McKinsey article. I would take major expenses and look at zero-based budgeting, then I would look at some of the minor, more predictable expenses and use incremental budgeting. So, and I'd kind of switch it up year to year. So I might, something that I had never looked at from a zero-based standpoint, I might throw that into the mix every once in a while. So that's kind of how I did it. That's kind of what McKinsey talks about doing. Incremental budgeting is still by far the most common method of budgeting out there. In order to have a budget be successful, you need to have accountability. So you have to live with the budget. You can't just do the budget and put it in the file drawer and forget about it. So if you manage to the budget and you use the budget, then you'll find that your employees are empowered by the budget. The various divisions and so forth can use the budget to manage themselves, as opposed to having to be top-down managed. You definitely want to stick to the plan. You don't want to just say, oh, well, you know, the budget says this, but let's do this. This looks like a good idea. Doesn't mean you can't change it, but you want to use it. You don't want to ignore it. If it's successful, you'll have various divisions sharing resources and cooperating with each other. because they'll be able to use the budget as a source of communication. Now, in reality, many budgets end up being not used this way. They're used as a way to hoard resources. So we overestimate what we might have to spend, and then at the end of the quarter, year, whenever we're finalizing our budget, we spend all the money we haven't spent already, so that they won't take it away from us. That's a really bad thing. It's inefficient, doesn't doesn't serve the nature, that doesn't serve the best interests of the organization, but it happens. It's definitely part of bad budgeting, is that we got to spend the money and we got to spend it now. If you have openness, good communication, and honesty, you end up with a very powerful budget process. Not easy to do, but if you can make it work, it's amazing. It's a remarkable process. So it's worth spending the time and effort to get that budget that really works. To get that budget that works, first of all, you have to have management that has vision. You have to know what your mission is, what it is, where you're trying to go. If you don't know where you're going, budgets don't work. The budgets are about getting you where you want to go. You have to have management that accepts the process of change management. Everybody hates change. Management has to embrace change and be willing to manage change. And management has to definitely focus on the important issues, not on the peripheral issues. So that's what you need from management to have a good budget process. Once again, those are hard things to come up with in many cases with management. Management doesn't always provide that. If you are successful with a budget, your managers feel in control, your employees are trusted and inspired to take action. It's a tool that helps you get to your critical success factors. It's definitely a good communication system. You can measure your progress towards your goals. You make smarter decisions, and you have to make sure, and this kind of probably doesn't really become a defining success thing, this might belong on the last slide. Employee performance has to be linked to the budget. So that how we grade or reward our employees has to be linked to the budget. If it's not linked to the budget, then the budget will get ignored. It'll get run around and ignored. And that brings me to sort of this is sort of Shaughnessy's saying. It's not unique or patented or anything, but positive results that get rewarded will get repeated. Negative results that get penalized will stop. And if you can measure it, you can manage it. If you can't measure it, it's really, really hard to manage. So, and that I always say, this sort of sounds like puppy dogs, right? If you've got a puppy, if you reward something with let's say a cookie or a pat or an attaboy, then they'll probably do that same thing again. If they don't get a cookie or an attaboy or a pat on the back, they'll probably stop doing it. They'll be penalized. And if you can figure out what it is that your puppy's doing, then you can manage it. If they come when they're supposed to come, then that's a good thing. If they don't come when they're supposed to come, that's a bad thing, right? So people are not that far different from that. People like to know what they're supposed to be doing, and they like to be rewarded. And if you're not happy with something, they like to know that so that they can change. It's really, really important, but you have to be able to measure it to manage it, and budgets are the measurement stick for the most part. How do we measure? They're the ruler. How do we measure whether we're succeeding or not? And if the budget is well designed, it becomes a really, really good ruler, measurement stick. If the budget's poorly designed, you get the wrong results. You'll still get results, they just won't be the results you want. So you have to make sure that the budget is extremely well designed in order to get the results that you want. So that wraps up my the budget chapter 6, with a few extra things thrown in from Shaughnessy. There'll be some short questions after this, and then we'll go on to the next chapter, I forget what chapter number it is, but we look at a couple of metrics that you use for evaluating budget variances. Very good. Thank you.